Okay, so you've been exploring these two really distinct digital art styles,
Yeah,
cyberpunk and vaporwave.
right.
And I think sometimes, like, when you see these things out in the wild on the internet,
Yeah.
they can feel kind of similar.
hmm
They both have these, like, retro elements, a lot of bright colors, and kind of a surreal vibe.
Definitely a lot of overlap in terms of like just the overall like digital aesthetic.
Yeah.
But they're actually coming from very different places conceptually.
Exactly, and that's what we're going to untangle today in this deep dive.
Yes.
So to start us off,
Okay.
can you just give us, like, a high-level overview of cyberpunk? Like, what are the core elements?
So cyberpunk at its heart is about this sort of like dystopian future
Okay.
where technology has advanced, but it hasn't necessarily made life better for everyone.
Right, like, it's not this, like, utopian Star Trek future.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's more like
So,
gritty. It's kind of like Blade Runner-esque, you
yeah,
know?
like that, I get that.
And so you'll see a lot of visuals that reflect that kind of anxiety about the future.
Yeah. Okay, like, what kind of visuals?
So think like, these massive cities
Yeah.
full of towering skyscrapers, but like everything's kind of run down, you know?
Oh, so it's like urban decay, but, like, futuristic?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And there's often a lot of rain, like those dark, rainy streets.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that. Lots of neon reflecting off the wet pavement.
Yes, exactly. That's a very cyberpunk thing.
Yeah.
And then you have these like, flying cars zipping around,
That's it.
holographic advertisements everywhere.
So it's very much like technology has taken over, but not necessarily in a good way.
Right. It's like technology is both this like, it's a solution, but also a problem.
It's like a double-edged sword.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And then what about the people? Like, how are people represented in cyberpunk art?
So often you'll see characters who are like augmented, like they have cybernetic implants where they've modified their bodies in some way to enhance their abilities.
So they're kind of pushing the boundaries of what it means to be human.
Exactly. And it makes you question, like, where does that line get crossed?
Right. Like, when does technology stop enhancing us
Yeah.
and start,
Dehumanizing us.
yeah, dehumanizing us? That's a good word for it.
Yeah. And there's often like a sense of alienation, in these characters.
Yeah, I could definitely see it.
That they're trying to find their place in this world that's so dominated by technology.
So visually, if I'm looking at a piece of cyberpunk art,
Mm-hmm.
what are the colors that are going to stand out to me?
Yeah.
Like, is there a particular palette?
Yeah, you'll definitely see a lot of like blues, purples, those kind of like cool tones.
Okay.
And then they'll often be contrasted with these like really bright pinks and sometimes like yellows, but it's very electric.
Like the colors themselves are almost like buzzing with energy.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And it kind of adds to that feeling of unease,
Yeah, like it's not necessarily a happy, bright future that we're looking at.
Right, right. It's more like a warning,
Okay, okay.
Like be careful where this technology might lead us.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about vaporwave.
Okay.
Because, like I said at the top,
Yeah.
when you look at vaporwave and cyberpunk side by side, they can feel kind of similar.
Right, right.
But vaporwave is doing something totally different conceptually.
Totally different, yeah.
So how would you describe, like, the essence of vaporwave?
So Vaporwave is all about this like curated nostalgia,
Okay.
It's drawing heavily on aesthetics from the 80s and 90s.
Okay, so it's very retro.
Very retro, yeah, but it's not just about like celebrating the past.
Okay.
It's more about using that nostalgia to critique something.
To critique what?
Well, a lot of times it's critiquing like consumerism,
Oh,
like
sure.
our obsession with material possessions and things like that.
Oh, okay, so it's like using those familiar images from the past
Mm-hmm.
to make a point about the present?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so visually, what are some of the hallmarks of vaporwave?
So you'll see a lot of like old computer graphics,
Okay.
like that pixelated look.
Like Windows 95.
Exactly, yeah. Windows 95, early Macintosh computers, all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
And then you'll also see a lot of like VHS effects.
Oh, yeah, like that staticky look.
Exactly, yeah. Like the tracking's a little bit off.
Okay.
The colors are kind of distorted.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's often a lot of pastel colors.
Okay, so that's where it starts to feel different from cyberpunk, right?
Yes, yeah. Cyberpunk is very like dark and neon.
Yeah, yeah.
Vaporwave is more like these soft pinks and blues and purples.
It's like a softer, gentler dystopia almost.
Yeah, yeah. That's a good way to put it.
And I've noticed there's often like Japanese text in vaporwave art.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a common element.
And I'm curious, like, what's that all about?
So I think it's partly because, in the 80s and 90s,
Mm,
Japan was really at the forefront of technology and consumer culture.
okay.
So it kind of represents that era, you know?
Hmm.
But it also adds this kind of like exotic, otherworldly element to the art.
It's like this weird juxtaposition of familiar and unfamiliar.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, and another thing that I see a lot in Vaporwave are these Greek statues and Roman busts.
Yes.
And that feels so out of place to me.
Right.
Like, what are they doing in this digital landscape of like pixelated sunsets and Japanese texts?
So I think that's part of the critique, like
Yep.
those classical elements represent this kind of like idealized past,
Okay.
like this romanticized vision of history that never really existed.
Hmm.
And by juxtaposing those with symbols of like 80s and 90s consumer culture,
Okay.
it's kind of saying, hey, we're not that different.
Oh,
Here.
so it's like we're still yearning for this idealized past,
Mm,
but in reality, we're just as caught up in materialism as ever.
exactly. Yeah.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's like a visual commentary on how we haven't really learned from our mistakes. We're
Yeah.
still kind of repeating the same patterns.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the techniques that are used in Vaporwave.
Okay.
Because one thing that I see a lot are these glitch effects and that distortion, like it's intentional.
Yes, very intentional.
Why is that?
So I think the glitches, the pixelation, all of that,
Yeah.
it's a way of disrupting the surface,
Okay.
Like consumerism tries to present this very sleek, polished image,
Hmm.
but underneath there's all this like, there's all this ugliness.
Okay, so the glitches are kind of revealing the cracks in the facade.
Exactly. Yeah.
And there's a term for that, right? Data motion.
Yes, data motion.
And that's where you intentionally corrupt digital files to create these warped visuals.
Right, exactly. And it creates this really unsettling feeling.
Yeah.
Like something's not quite right.
It's like the system's breaking down.
Yeah, exactly.
So we've talked about Cyberpunk and Vaporwave separately,
Mhm.
but I think it's interesting that they both seem to be creating these alternate realities.
Right.
Like they're both world building in a sense,
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation.
but they're doing it for different purposes.
Exactly.
Cyberpunk is kind of warning us about where we might be headed, and Vaporwave is using the past to critique the present.
Yes, and both of them are using digital art as a way to express these really complex ideas.
And I think it's also interesting to think about how technology is influencing the evolution of these movements.
Oh, absolutely.
Like Cyberpunk was born in an era of nascent internet and clunky tech.
Right.
But today, we have AI, VR, hyper-realistic rendering.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how is that changing the way that cyberpunk artists are creating?
Well, I think now they can create these worlds that are almost indistinguishable from reality,
Oh, wow.
which makes it even more unsettling,
It's like blurring the lines between fiction and reality.
Exactly. Yeah, and it makes you question, like, is this our future?
Right. It's
Yeah.
like that line is getting really blurry.
Yeah.
And then for Vaporwave,
Mm-hmm.
it seems like the very tools that it's critiquing
Right.
are now being used to refine its aesthetic.
Absolutely. Yeah, you have artists using AI to generate these nostalgic images.
Right.
Or they're using sophisticated 3D modeling to create these familiar yet warped landscapes.
It's like this really interesting feedback loop.
Yeah.
So to kind of bring it all together,
Mhm.
you've got cyberpunk, this dark mirror reflecting a potential future,
Yeah.
and vaporwave, this pastel-hued ghost of consumerism past.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
And both of them, I think, are really challenging us to think about our relationship with technology, with the past, and with the future that we're creating.
Absolutely. And I think the question for you listening is, which one resonates with you more
Mm-hmm.
and why?
Yeah.
Like, what does that say about your own anxieties and hopes for the future?
Yeah, that's a great question to leave everyone with
Mm-hmm.
lots to think about.
Yes.
Okay, well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into cyberpunk and vaporwave.
It has. Yeah.
Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Sounds good.